Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be talking about the drug war down under. We'll also be discussing prisons and how diet affects your mental health. More coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to episode 249 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. It's Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And we've got quite a few stories to get into. A few of them kind of relate. We've got one about the war on drugs, as well as one about incarceration nation, is what it's being called. They kind of are dovetailed with each other. We're also going to be talking about the internet and, the constant clampdown that we've been discussing over the years. I think we've got a story out of the UK this time, as well as, how your diet affects your mood. This is something that I think people have kind of known for years, but now the science is starting to come out as well and catch up with what people have thought. Does eating fast food make you happier? Well, in the moment, maybe, but long-term effects might say something different. But first, let's start with the war on drugs. And not a story having to do with the United States so much, but another Western country. It's coming from Australia, correct?
Yeah, I guess it's more of a southern country than a Western country.
But
right?
Western culture, I should say.
I suppose.
It's the same thing as here
They
in
speak
Europe,
English.
wherever.
They drive on a different
They
side
speak
of the
English.
road.
Yeah, but they have the same type of philosophy on getting involved in personal matters and such.
Yeah, generally that's true. And this has to do with the Foreign Affairs Minister Bob Carr, who is now among a group of prominent Australians who have declared the war on drugs a failure in the most significant challenge to drug laws in decades. And here's a quote: "The prohibition of illicit drugs is killing and criminalizing our children, and we are letting it happen," says a report released today by the group, which includes the former federal police chief, Mick Palmer, and the former New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions, Nicholas Crowdery, the former Western Australia Premier, which would basically be the governor, Geoff Gallop, I guess roughly the governor, I'm not really translating this well, a former Defense Department Secretary, Paul Barrett, and former federal health ministers, Michael Wooldridge and Peter Baum. What they're calling for here is an end to a law enforcement approach and the decriminalization, or at least certain people here in this group calling for the decriminalization, complete legalization, and taxation of all drugs. So they're calling for reform similar to what we saw in Portugal 10 years ago, Toby, where we saw use of all drugs on the user level decriminalized or legalized and regulated. Basically what they want to do is destroy the profit potential for criminals who are in charge of the drug trade right now, and try to address some of the social ills, some of the health ills associated with drug use, and possibly reduce drug use, which is what we did see in Portugal following decriminalization. And this isn't coming in isolation. The president of Guatemala, who I'll point out is he actually is a former general, a hard right politician calling for law and order and a crackdown on crime. He is calling for an end to the war on drugs because he believes it's a distraction from, actual law enforcement actually cleaning up Guatemala. We've also got Colombia now entertaining legislation to legalize the cultivation of marijuana and coca, which is the base for cocaine, on a small level. So it's not just this story, Toby. Around the world, I think many countries are, across cultures, across political affiliations, are reconsidering the war on drugs, and they recognize that the war mentality, the military mentality, is not working. And the only, the way that this relates to people in the United States is that it's going to be very difficult. Even though the war on drugs hasn't been successful to this point, it would be even more difficult to try to conduct a war on drugs in isolation.
Well, I think that it's been clear that the U.S. has been kind of financing and bullying and pressuring other countries around the world when it comes to their view and their laws and policies when it comes to the war on drugs. I mean, the war on drugs is very strong here in the United States, but one of the reasons it's a global war on drugs is because of the U.S. policy. It's funded by the U.S., it's pressured by the U.S., for a variety of different reasons. But most of all, I think you can follow the money trail. I mean, it's a big investment. My problem with it is I'm not trying to promote drug use at all. I think that drugs can be horribly harmful. But at some point, you have to give a risk assessments here and say which is worse, the criminalizing these people who clearly have medical issues with addiction, or finding ways to help them and reduce some of the social ills that are being done by drugs, rather than just the crime and punishment mentality, lock them up, throw away the key type situation that we're in, which clearly is not working.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that drug use is a victimless crime. I mean, you can talk about social ills. Certainly, a lot of people do have problems with drug use, and they have problem drug use, or they're chemically addicted, whatever it is, they use it habitually. A lot of people don't, and that's the other thing we have to remember here, is that people are being arrested and incarcerated every day for basically the way they choose to spend their free time. You might not agree with it, you might say it's a high-risk way to spend your time, but basically what they're doing here is they're choosing to use certain drugs which are not legal in lieu of drugs which are, because as far as the law is concerned here in the U.S., with the exception of some dry counties and things like that, if you want to drink your life away or drink in your spare time, that's not an issue for the government to be involved in. They're not going to arrest you, provided you're 21 years old. They're not going to try to arrest you for your own good. Same with nicotine, caffeine, a whole host of over-the-counter medications which have the potential to do damage if abused or to be habit-forming. So you can see the disparity there, the way that we treat some drugs and the way that we treat others. And what they're pointing out here, Toby, is that one of the things they pointed out about how the war on drugs was a failure was they had sniffer dogs at train stations in some areas of Australia, and that's something we see here in the United States too. It's led to an erosion of our civil liberties. It's gutted banking privacy. A lot of the ways that government follows your financial transactions now have to do with drug trafficking and money laundering, but it applies to all of us. And when you look at who's benefiting from this, well, it's the DEA and other law enforcement agencies, and it's narco traffickers. It's the FARC in Colombia. It's the former Taliban, whatever you want to call them now, and Al Qaeda to some extent, making money off opium sales, or basically the raw products for heroin production in Afghanistan. It's criminals and militants and
governments.
It's
interesting. Remember those commercials that came out after September 11th that related marijuana use to supporting terrorism? Well, to a certain extent, that is correct. I don't know how much of it's coming from marijuana. I think a lot of it is more of those marijuana. Right, the opiates, and more of the higher profit drugs there. But anytime you have a black market, where do terrorists get their money? Well, it's a lot of the time it's black market something, whether it's being counterfeiting goods or something like selling drugs. How do you get rid of their profit margin? Well, it's as easy as that. You take away the black market aspect of it. You really want to give terrorism a blow? Well, take away their profit motive. I mean, make them work for their money. I mean, it would be a very different, not to say that it's not work to be a criminal bad guy, I guess, but if you take away that profit motive, it would definitely be a changing scenario for them. I mean, who knows? I'm just saying, like...
Well, yeah, and you have to remember, I mean, and regardless of what your views are on the way that narcotics should be treated, likely what's going to happen is that they're going to be, if they are legalized, and this is what we've seen in places where they have been, is likely they're going to be legalized, taxed, and regulated. So a lot of the money would either, the profits from this would be going to private producers, and then the tax revenue would be used by governments, whether it's to provide social services,
offset some of the social costs of using the
Well,
drugs.
yeah, addiction treatment or whatever, just increase revenue so that you can offset it perhaps with a cut to the sales tax or the property tax or the income tax if you want to make it revenue neutral. But the current situation doesn't really benefit anybody at all. I mean, to be quite honest, people who object to the idea that the government might tax it, you have to remember if marijuana were a legal product and could be produced by farmers, and sold in, say, the same way that alcohol is, you would be looking at a product that was far less expensive. The reason that illicit drugs are so expensive is not because they're difficult to produce. Marijuana is probably one of the easier crops out there to grow. It's just the fact that it's illegal, the fact that a lot of these drugs are intercepted before they make it to market by law enforcement groups. And if you're looking at 20 years in prison to grow and distribute a product, Toby, criminals are not going to do that unless they're getting good money for it. And people are willing to pay the inflated prices.
Often very bad people who do it as well, not...
Oh, yeah, horrible people. As I point out, the FARC in Colombia, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the drug traffickers in Mexico, the cartels are just horrendous. I mean, these are some of the worst human beings in the world. And most
they're
of these
spraying
people,
the plants with chemicals and lacing the drugs and
killing people.
Yes.
They're cutting people's heads off.
I mean,
if you go to Juarez, they will cut your head off if they think you're going to snitch.
I mean, meth is a very, very, very horrible, horrible drug that no one ever should use. But if you want to look at some of the worst effects of the drug, it's because it's done in bathtubs, and it's the added chemicals because of its impurities that make it so devastating to the human mind. Yes, it's a horrible drug in itself, but but the way that it's made on the black market makes it so dangerous. Just like during Prohibition, the bathtub gin was making people go blind. Same deal here. Yeah, alcohol not good for you, but better for you than the bathtub gin? Yes. All right, well, a related story, we've touched on it a little bit, is the prison situation we've got going on here, not only in the U.S., but around the world, but it's definitely worse in the U.S. than anywhere else. This is a CNN piece, an opinion piece from Fareed Zarkaya about what he calls incarceration nation. Pat Robertson, the high priest of the religious right, had some startling things to say about drugs. Quote, "I really believe that we should treat marijuana the way we treat beverage alcohol," Mr. Robertson said in a recent interview. Quote, "I've never used marijuana and I don't intend to, but it's just one of those things that I think the war on drugs just has not succeeded. The reason Robertson is for legalizing marijuana is that it's created a prison problem in America that has swelled beyond what most Americans can imagine. It's completely out of control," Mr. Robertson said. Prisons are being overcrowded with juvenile offenders having to do with drugs. And the penalties, the maximums, some of them could get 10 years for possession of a joint of marijuana. It makes no sense at all. I think he's using some older drug numbers here from the 1980s, but whatever. He's on the right track, at least, I guess. The total number of Americans under correctional supervision, prisons, paroles, etc., is 7.1 million, more than the entire state of Massachusetts. Wow, that's quite a few people. No other country even comes close to the rates of incarceration. We have 760 prisoners per 100,000 people. Most European countries have 1/7 that number per capita. Let's see here. In the 1980s, rates of incarceration were a quarter what they are now. What has changed is, well, that war on drugs that was started. Quote, "We here in America make up 5% of the world population, but we make up 25% of jail prisoners. We now have over 3,000. The number might be higher than that, but about 3,000 federal crimes, and every time the liberals pass a bill, I don't care what it involves, they stick criminal sentences on it." So he's blaming the liberals on this one because he's a right wing. This is Pat Robertson speaking. "They don't feel there is just any way people are going to keep a law unless they can put them in jail. So we have put jails filled with people who are white-collar criminals." It's so funny how the Republicans or the right will blame the left and the left will blame the right. If you heard a liberal talking about the war on drugs, he'd be blaming the Republicans for building all the jails. And it goes on, but nothing too startling here. It talks about some of the numbers, about the billions of dollars, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that's spent every single year to incarcerate people. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Oh, he also talks about how the state spends on average $8,667 per student per year. It spends about $50,000 per inmate per year. So just where are you going to spend your money?
Well, the costs to the taxpayers are huge. And then if you look at the example, because some people say, well, violent crime rates are lower in the U.S. than they used to be, and that's thanks to, well, we'll just lock everybody away. But if you look at what they're saying there about European prison populations, most of the rest of the Western world has far less of a problem with violent crime than we do, at least.
And they still fight a war on drugs.
Right, right. But but with a prison population, averaging about 1/7 hours per capita, it says to me that no, having a large prison population in no way guarantees that you're going to be safe. The situation in the U.S.
it makes people less safe in a lot of cases, because the problem is you arrest someone, you put them in jail for drug use or whatever it is, then they're in jail for a while, maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is. Then they get out of jail. So they're not in there forever. It's this rotating door. They come out of jail. Now they can't get a job because they've got a record. They learned all this bad stuff in jail from the other bad people that they were locked up with. So what are they going to do now? Live a nice, wholesome life? Get off the drugs that were available readily in prisons? What's the next step for them? I mean, so the more people you put in jail, the more people will come out of jail and then be on the streets learning all this bad stuff that they learned in jail. I mean, just think about it. The more and more people, like, what if you had half the people in jail? Every time they get out, you'd have to lock your doors away from them because they can't get a job, they still want to eat, they still want to do their drugs. Not all of them, but in general, it's a revolving door.
When you look at our whether you want to call them crime and punishment or correction, I think it's more, in the United States, it's more accurate to call it crime and punishment. When you look at our policies compared to Western nations and then compared to countries that we would consider less than civilized, on a whole range of numbers, the number of people that we execute, the number, the kinds of prison sentences we hand down, even for victimless crimes, for drug offenses. I mean, we would think it would be ridiculous if you were sentenced to 10 years for selling alcohol in a Muslim country. We would think that would be a real, harsh, draconian measure. We do it to people for selling drugs all the time. So it's just a matter of which drugs we prohibit. When you look at our correctional system here in the U.S., Toby, I think there's far too much of a tendency to want to just throw the book at people. Then you've got the war on drugs and victimless crimes wrapped up in this thing, where I don't think it's the government's job to try to address those things, especially not through a correctional system, like through a prison system. And when you look at even things that I think should be illegal, like property offenses, when you're dealing with young people, first-time offenders, minor property offenses, you're dealing with something like shoplifting, I think it makes a lot more sense to actually have a correctional system where you actually try to prevent recidivism.
Yeah, some kind of,
I mean, when you get to the point where you're dealing with murderers and rapists and violent criminals,
throw away the key.
Repeat offenders, then you're getting to the point where it's not about correction, it's about
any
separation.
Violent offenders, absolutely, throw away the key. I don't care, but I do this. I read the paper whenever I get a chance. I subscribe to it and I read it, and it's constantly about these petty criminals, robbers, robbing cars, breaking into homes, even robbing. I think a lot of it, you read more, and they have also been busted for drugs and all this other stuff. And then it talks about how they were in jail last year, and I just think to myself, well, that didn't work. So now he's going to go back for another couple of years, and he's going to come out, and do I need to start keeping a list of all these people that I see on a daily basis right here in Cheshire County? It's a relatively small community, but every single day there's more of these little petty criminals going to jail, and they're all going to be getting out soon, and I'm sure there's a revolving doors of others getting out, and somewhere the system has definitely broken. I don't know how exactly to fix it. I do think restorative justice, some kind of a correctional system, is the way to go, but it's definitely broken. Like, we don't want to continue to do the same stupid thing over and over again, because it ain't working. It's time to find
I think there has been a lot of success with diversion programs and alternative sentencing programs.
Those are what's being cut right now.
Well, I know they're what's being cut, and that's unfortunate, because in the long run that's going to mean more expense to the state, because you're doing away with these alternative sentencing programs and diversion programs, which in many places, and anecdotally I've heard here in New Hampshire, have been pretty successful at keeping people from reoffending, keeping people from ending up in this revolving door of the correctional system, which is what we want, right? I mean, theoretically, it's better to keep people from preventing more crimes in the future, have them out in the workforce and society where they can be a productive member of society rather than rotting in a prison cell, and at a lower expense to taxpayers, because as you pointed out, Toby, something like $50,000 a year on an inmate, that's a lot of kids you could be educating with that money, or giving back to the taxpayers so that they could spend it in the way they want to.
So I can put a good security system on my house.
Right. So, I mean, maybe that's what you want to do. But I think it is clear that what we're doing is not working. And if a large prison population makes you feel safer, it shouldn't, because you're really not safer than people in other countries.
That's the problem. I sometimes, and I think it too, when I read, oh, they finally got that bank robber I read about 4 months ago. And he was addicted to drugs too. They got him with heroin. He was just across the border in Massachusetts after he robbed that bank and probably got himself $1,500. Throw the book at him. Don't let him come out. He's a dangerous man. I don't want him on the street. That's what's going through my mind.
Well, once you get to the point of robbing a bank, particularly armed robbery, I think that's the point where we might be talking about
well, then I read further. Oh, he had been in jail before.
You don't get there.
He had. And so I keep on reading these stuff, and I'm thinking the same thing. I'm thinking, throw the book at all these people, the little shoplifters. Teach them a lesson. They won't do it again. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. The people who won't do it again learned that when they were like 10, 11, 12. They learned, don't take stuff from the store. It's not right. It's the difference between right and wrong. It's the other people that need something different, something more. The slap on the wrist technique didn't really work for them. The heavy-handed swat of the law probably isn't going to work as well either. And like I said, I'm not saying just let them go, do nothing. I'm just saying do something different.
Yeah.
Let smarter people than I come up with the solutions, rather than stupid politicians who really don't know what they're talking about and just go vote on emotion. That emotion that I have when I read the paper and I go, oh, these dangerous people making my neighborhood unsafe. I should join Neighborhood Watch. Where are those surveillance cameras?
Yeah, well, and it's true. We have seen an increase in criminal activity even here in Keene, New Hampshire. We've seen bank robberies. We've seen a lot of break-ins to cars. We've seen, in some cases, home invasions. And when you look at most of these property crimes, Toby, where people are, whether it's an actual robbery or whether it's people
looking for
people, just I don't know, stealing scrap metal or something and selling it. Most of this, I would say at least half of the convenience store robberies, the bank holdups, the break-ins to cars, the break-ins to homes, at least, I feel comfortable saying at least half of that is a result of the war on drugs. And it's in the story. If you read the police section in the newspaper, take all the property crimes in there, and they'll tell you in half the story. Most of the time, they don't. I don't see too many other reasons why people are doing these things. So I'm guessing that a lot of the other half, where they don't tell me the reason why, where they don't tell me that the person was busted with drugs at the time, in many of those cases, drugs are involved too. So I think a rethink of the war on drugs is necessary to address this crime problem.
Yeah. Hey, you know what, Nick? I'm almost at the point in my life where I've got the house and everything. I don't want people to rob it. I'm becoming an old man here, and the young and wild streak is out of me, where I say, screw authority. Well, not really all out of me, of course. But if the war on drugs actually worked, I'm at the point where I might actually consider it. But it doesn't work. It does the opposite of what we want it to do. I mean, if heavy-handed law and order worked, well, maybe we could have a conversation, but it doesn't work. That's the problem. Well, one of the problems. Not to mention the humanitarian aspect of it, where I really do think that being in a prison cell is the worst torture you can put someone through.
I can't imagine.
I would do anything to stay out of a prison cell.
Right.
Oh, horrible.
Can
you imagine it?
10, 15 years of your life. I mean, and to me, to take that much of somebody's life, I mean, to really think about the implication there, because, in some cases, just for mere possession of a drug will land you a few years. Not so much in New England, but in many states. And especially when you run into crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine, there's a whole host of what are really racist sentencing laws. They're designed to put black people in prison for a long period of time because that's okay, apparently, is what the lawmakers felt. I mean,
that's what they felt when they made marijuana illegal, right?
No, but the practical implication, suburban white people use powdered cocaine is the idea. The lawmakers use powdered cocaine, and they figured, well, it's those inner city folks who used crack cocaine when the crack epidemic started, and they were more than willing to throw minorities in prison for a couple decades. But it's not just minorities, Toby. When you think about throwing somebody in prison for 20 years, think of all the stuff you've done for 20 years. Think about sitting in a box for that 20 years, just rotting away, no purpose.
I've just been
How
figuring out.
how productive would you be when you got out? I'm sure you'd be in a great mood. I'm sure you'd be well adjusted with society.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd be ready to go take it out on society myself.
I think that's typically what you do when you get out of prison after 20
Unfortunately.
years, which is why you often end up back inside.
Well,
prison.
first you might go try to get a job, and people laugh at you, and you find out even if you get a job what kind of work you're going to do, and then you go, okay, well, what else do I have to lose? I might as well go get high again, and you go back to the old ways. So. Unfortunately, not all of them. There are some success stories out there. I don't know what creates resiliency exactly. Wish it did, but overall. All right, well, we did promise a couple other stories. Let's go across the old pond to the internet.
Across the pond
through
to
the tubes
internet.
to the UK.
Yes, that British internet.
Is it the same internet?
It is all the same internet, so I've been told.
We're connected through tubes.
Under legislation expected in next month's Queen's speech, internet companies will be instructed to install hardware enabling GCHQ, the government's electronic listening agency, much like our NSA, to examine on demand any phone call made, text message, and email sent, and website accessed in real time, the Sunday Times reported. A previous attempt to introduce similar laws was abandoned by the former Labour government in 2006 in the face of fierce opposition. The Liberal Democrats in this case, who sort of claim to be kind of the small government party in the UK, even though they're really not, have said that they will try to kill this legislation in Parliament if it's not significantly watered down. But
a watered down version would be just fine.
But what we're talking about here, I mean, with this legislation, is not foreign to us in the United States.
I had a story with a similar version that's coming over here. It's not talking about real time so much. It's just talking about ISPs being forced to share everything with government agencies without any kind of a warrant. You know, I just don't know what they're going to do with all that information, Nick. Not even Google knows what to do with all that information except make money. I don't know what the government's purposes are with it, but it doesn't make me feel all rosy and happy and warm.
They'll probably get confused and they'll probably miss the actual terrorists because they're overloaded with data. They couldn't even catch the 9/11 hijackers, and they had solid leads. They were following them, and they didn't catch them.
Back in 2007, there were 1 million people on the terror watch list. That's a lot of people to be tracking. Say, let's try to sift through that a little bit. Get down to maybe a few thousand bad guys out there that are really out to no good, rather than you and me who are just complaining about the world. Yeah. Anyways.
Well, I don't know if we're on the terror watch list or not.
I wouldn't be too surprised. We're not terrorists. We're just complainy type people, I guess. Want to rant and rave. Anyways, I do have this story about eating fast food. It's linked to depression, and we're out of time, so I guess it's just that. If you didn't figure it out, you feel like crap after you eat at McDonald's, well, overall, it's also going to make you feel like crap. Fast food equals feeling like crap, more depressed. 51% more likely to be depressed. In fact, you are what you eat. The stomach is connected to the brain. And their new science is coming out, mark my words. I heard Radiolab told me next wave of depression drugs is going to be through the gut, not through the brain chemicals. Well, having to do with them. Until next week, Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a good one.